Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. As Prime Minister Modi departs for the United States, we asked how significant a visit is this, and could it change the very character of India's relationship with the United States? Joining me for today's special discussion is the well-known author and analyst, the host of CNN's GPS, and a columnist for the Washington Post, Fareed Zakaria. Fareed Zakaria, Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin has called the Prime Minister's forthcoming visit to America a transforming moment. Kurt Campbell says it will consecrate the relationship. Is that really how Washington sees this visit? Or is that rhetoric designed to flatter Indian ears?
Well, naturally, it's a bit of both. But I think it is I wouldn't call it a turning point. The turning point happened under Manmohan Singh with the nuclear deal. But what it is the culmination of really 2 decades of a strategic shift that has taken place in New Delhi and in Washington. And it is true that the relationship has achieved a certain critical momentum with both sides very comfortable with the idea of a enduring strategic relationship. And so it is true that it will mark, I think, something very significant, both for the 2 countries and for the world.
Let me pick up on that point you made, that the turning point happened under Manmohan Singh and the nuclear deal. Prime Minister Modi's party and his supporters and fans say that even if the turning point happened under Manmohan Singh, Mr. Modi has ensured that the car of that relationship has sped down the road a lot faster and gone a lot further. In other words, he's taken the relationship to an altogether different level. Would you agree with that, or would you say that's a bit exaggerated?
I think it's true with some caveats. I think it's true that the car has moved faster in the last, let's say, 5 to 7 years. I would argue that the principal impetus for that was the border clash in the Himalayas. That really, to my mind, was a transforming effect for India's strategic elite. Until then, it had been very hard to get India's elite aligned around the idea that the rise of China was the fundamental geopolitical fact in the world today, and that Indian policy had to reflect that changed reality. That the rise of China meant India needed a new strategy, a new set of strategic priorities. I remember Manmohan Singh telling me once that it was so difficult to convince the Indian bureaucracy to go along with the nuclear deal, even though the Americans had made all the concessions. I mean, Americans literally, the Bush administration took every Indian demand and put it on a silver platter and said, here you are. Everything you've wanted for 30 years, we're giving you. And there was still suspicion in New Delhi. There was still this kind of, vestiges of non-alignment, vestiges of a certain, reluctance to be a partner to the West. And I think the Himalayan clash, really changed not just the strategic elite, but in India itself. And you see this in the opinion polls. So I think that was the really big event that took place. The second part I point out is that India does not have a competitive democracy at the federal level anymore. And that was always part of the problem, is whatever one party said, the other party would oppose. Modi dominates and the BJP dominates, so they can kind of move things forward. So I tend to think those were the driving forces. But look, be that as it may, Modi has driven the car faster. I'm talking about the forces that impel, the forces that made it easier. But it's true, he has driven the car faster.
But you're also suggesting that he's driven the car faster, but something that propelled that movement was the unwelcome Chinese knock on the door. And in a sense, it made Modi realize we need American support. We need that comfort. Let's open the door and walk down faster.
Yes,
and
in fact, I think
forgive me.
No, and I think he needed that, honestly, in a way that perhaps someone like Manmohan Singh didn't. Manmohan Singh was, broadly speaking, comfortable with the idea of a closer and closer strategic relationship with the US. There are elements in the BJP, as you know, that have always been, for more cultural reasons, suspicious of the West. So, but all of that melted in a sense once you had the clash in the Himalayas. And I think that in a way, the Himalayas clash was a reminder that what is going on here. People in the U.S. sometimes blame the United States for some of the hostilities or some of the poor relationship between the U.S. and China now. A lot of what has happened has been driven by China and by Xi Jinping. And if you look at Xi's policy toward India, toward Australia, toward the Philippines, these claims with regard to the sea boundaries of countries. These are all areas where China has become more aggressive, more expansionist, and it is producing a reaction. And most dramatically in India. And the Chinese, unlike in those other places, do not seem to be trying to diffuse the reaction. They have this very complex border problem with India. They have not really tried to solve it. They've built up fortifications. They've built up the capacity to surge. Even if the troops pull back, they have kept in place a huge infrastructure now that allows them to surge, all of which tells you they're not comfortable with somehow amicably resolving this border dispute with India.
With that in the background, let's focus a little on what could be the highlights of the visit that starts on the 21st. There's a lot of attention in India on the state banquet and on the address to Congress, which would be Mr. Modi's second address to the US Congress, something no Indian Prime Minister has been given before. How much of this is ceremony and glamour? How much is of substance and of real significance?
The state banquet, of course, is pure ceremony. The joint address, look, it's symbolic, it's important. As you say, no Indian Prime Minister has done it twice. But I think the real heart, the meat and potatoes, will be in the various negotiations that take place and that have largely taken place. Jake Sullivan was in New Delhi just a few days ago, and that's where a lot of the agreements were finalized. And the most important element of the relationship in the short term is the defense cooperation. India needs to recognize that if it is going to move in the direction of having a strategic relationship with the United States, it should try to turn its defense industrial base more toward an American supplied one, rather than what it now has, which is a Russian-supplied one. Look, there are two fundamental reasons for that. One, to put it very bluntly, the American stuff is much better. You are watching what Russian equipment in the Ukraine now. We watched Russian equipment in the Gulf War. This is actually an old story. Russian equipment is not surprisingly substandard. The US, on the other hand, produces really, in this area, few would contest, the best equipment, the best kit, as they call it, in the world. So why should India not have the advantage of having the most modern, the most capable? And by the way, as we get more, as the software revolution and the AI revolution work their way through the defense industry, this is going to be even more true. And India wants to be at the cutting edge. The second is from a strategic point of view, India needs to recognize that the Chinese-Russian alliance is now very strong, and it is very focused in the defense area. So India might find itself facing an awkward situation where if it were ever to need to use equipment and support in some kind of conflict with China, where it needed to rely on Russian resupply, and Beijing told Moscow, Moscow is now Beijing's very junior partner. If Beijing were to say to Moscow, don't resupply India, what would happen? This is a real strategic dilemma that India needs to think through. So for both reasons, India should be moving much more rapidly than it is toward this strategic modernization. And here you do have all the old elements of the Indian bureaucracy interfering. Look, I understand there's a legacy, there's all kinds of reasons, but it's a bad position. India is in a bad strategic place. It needs to get out of it.
To pick up on the point you're making, there is an expectation, possibly on both sides, that two major defense and advanced technology deals could be done whilst Prime Minister Modi is in Washington. One is speculated to be for 31 MQ-9 Predator drones, and the other, perhaps the other one is more important, for co-production in India of General Electric's F414 jet engines. If these two deals are concluded, would you see them as landmark achievements?
I think they're landmark in the sense that they should be the beginning of a process. It's still very small. I mean, I would want something much more ambitious. I really think, I mean, India gets 90% of its advanced weaponry from Russia. I think India should be thinking about a world in which in 10 years, that number is close to reversed, that it would be getting 90% of it from the United States. That's the scale of change I think that needs to happen. But this is a very important start. And my understanding is both those deals will happen.
Just one little point I'll correct. According to SIPRI, the Swedish institute, over the last 5 years, the quantum of equipment supplied from Russia has come down from 66-67% in the previous 5 years to 45-46% in the last. But it is still by far the single biggest supplier.
The part I was talking about, Karan, is what people call advanced weaponry. So it's the most cutting edge. Yes, you're right that there's more routine commoditized equipment that is coming from everywhere. But the most advanced stuff is still coming from Russia. Now, to be fair, that was partly a legacy also of US support for Pakistan, where there were certain deals made where certain very advanced US fighter equipment, for example, cannot go to India. And the US has changed policy on that as well, which I have also urged. So what I was talking about is the real cutting edge stuff.
Now, the Indian Express has reported, and I assume the paper knows what it's talking about, that India will receive 11 key technologies if the General Electric deal goes through. And the paper describes them as major manufacturing technologies. Now, you know that if this is going to go through, it would need a nod from the US Congress. More importantly, perhaps, General Electric itself would have to feel comfortable that transferring these technologies does not mean losing copyright or handing them over to someone else they don't want to have. Are those going to be insuperable obstacles, or do you think a way will be found around these hurdles?
Congress will pass it. There's bipartisan support for the relationship with India in Congress. That isn't a problem. And General Electric, I think that problem can be solved. Look, one of the advantages India has is it is a country ruled by law, and that rule of law provisions are strong and courts do uphold them. You know, yes, I know it's not perfect, but I think that I think it would be possible to satisfy a company that it had protections on those fronts. It's, by the way, to India's interest to make sure that there are strong protections. India needs to be thinking about a world in which it is producing a lot more intellectual property and patents than it is consuming. And because that is the world we're going to go into. I'm confident that India is going to be one of the key producers of patents and intellectual property in the world. And it needs to recognize that it needs all the protections and, you know, the kind of legal apparatus that allows that.
Let's come to a second issue. The Indian side has officially let it be known that the Ukraine issue, as well as implications arising out of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, will be a major subject when President Biden and Prime Minister Modi sit down for their conversations. Now, tell me, As India's import of cheap Russian oil crosses 40% of India's oil requirement, and that happened in May, with India still refusing to criticize the Russian invasion, is the White House concerned about India's stand? Or do you accept the point of view of Jake Sullivan, who said, and I'm quoting him, "We are investing in a relationship that we are not going to judge by one issue, even if that issue is quite consequential"?
Look, I think the other way I would put what Jake is saying is they have come to terms with India's stand on Ukraine. I don't think Washington likes it. I think Washington would prefer a different stand, but it has come to terms with it. On the buying of oil, they have no problem. Look, something people don't understand is the sanctions against Russia have been fairly carefully devised. They are devised to allow Russia to sell oil on the global market, not to Western countries. And the reason for that is because you want Russian oil to find its way to the global markets. If you did not have Russian supply on the markets, oil would be at $200 a barrel. Russia is one of the 3 or 4 largest exporters of oil in the world. If all that oil was simply shut out of the market, the laws of supply and demand tell you all that supply goes away, the price goes up like crazy. And that would plunge, large parts of the world into a recession. So the sanctions are devised to allow Russia to sell its oil, but force it to sell it at a discount to reduce the revenues for Vladimir Putin. India buying the oil fulfills that at a discount, which is what it is doing, as is China, fulfills that policy. The part that I think Washington would like to see more is that India be more vocal, that this is a violation of a rules-based international order, that it is, naked aggression, that it cannot be upheld, that it cannot be rewarded. And India has not said that. And, to my mind, it's unfortunate. This is an area India believes very strongly in sovereignty. And this would be an occasion to make that clear. And I don't think it would jeopardize the relationship with Russia. And I think that there is a certain value when your interests and your values are aligned to allowing you to say that. India has a certain stature in the world because it is the world's most populous democracy. And it would be nice to sometimes see it articulate its values with that stature in mind.
I'll come to that value issue in a moment's time, but what about the fact that a fair amount of the oil India buys from Russia and then refines, and therefore technically it becomes Indian oil, no longer Russian, is actually sent to Europe? The European Commission did express a certain amount of disapproval, not so much at India exporting it, but the fact that European countries were buying it. Since then, it seems the European Commission has actually changed their position. But is that an issue that somewhere rankles in the West?
No, as I say, as you correctly point out, Karan, they're buying it, they're importing it, and they're not, they're not foolish enough to believe it's actually Indian oil. They understand what is going on, and as I said, the goal here is not to take all this oil off the market. The goal is to reduce the revenues to Vladimir Putin. And if you can do that, and the price cap seems to be doing that, you have achieved what you can. Look, it's not ideal because you would love to starve Putin of revenues because it would make him perhaps recalculate the support for the war. But because Russia is so critical to global oil markets, you can't shut it out of those markets. So this is the suboptimal second best solution that the West has come up with. And I think they're living with it. India is playing a normal, rational part in that. It's doing what is to its advantage. It's getting oil at a big discount. I really don't think the oil is the central issue here.
Let's then come to the state of Indian democracy and how that's viewed both by the American media and, more importantly, what the American media's viewpoint means to the White House. And I'm going to quote the paper that you write for, the Washington Post. In an editorial that they did on the 17th, that's just 3 days ago, the paper talked about India's democratic backsliding, retreat from democracy, majoritarian Hindu nationalism, communal violence, and toxic hate. and a broad assault on freedom of expression and dissent. And then the Post in its editorial said, the United States cannot remain silent, and its advice to President Biden was, Mr. Biden should say something openly. Do you think he will? Or will that be a red line he will not cross while Mr. Modi is in Washington?
I doubt he would. I think that the administration regards the Indian relationship as really critical strategically. I cannot think of a relationship it regards as more critical in the world right now. I mean, it's on a par with its relationship with Japan and with key Western states. So with a relationship that is that critical, and in a context where, Modi is the elected prime minister, legitimately elected twice of this country, very popular in India. I think that Biden is going to be careful not to do anything that will unnecessarily jeopardize the relationship. Will he say something privately is the more interesting question. I honestly hope so, but I don't know. I think it would be useful if Biden could privately, off the record, say something to Modi about some of these issues. But as you know, Karan, I very much doubt they will have much effect. This is these illiberal tendencies, the assault on the media, the rising tide of Hindu nationalism. These are very big and broad trends that have taken place over the last decade. I don't think they're going to be switched off because certainly any outsider says anything. If there were a public criticism of India, I think it would, if anything, it would produce a reaction, a negative reaction that would be, that would bring out all the old Indian nationalism and anti-colonialism and all that. How dare Western powers tell us what about our democracy? Look at their own. So I don't think it would be productive to do it publicly. I think there is some virtue to the President of the United States speaking truthfully privately, but even that, I'm not quite sure it would have much impact.
Let's at this point broaden the discussion a bit and turn to the issue about how both countries characterize and describe their relationship. They see themselves as the oldest and the largest democracy, and they claim to each other that their relationship is based upon shared values, shared principles and beliefs which they cherish. But here's the question. When you look at the increasing majoritarianism and intolerance of dissent in India, the cavalier treatment of the Election Commission and Parliament by the Modi government, the use of the Central Bureau of Investigation and the Enforcement Directorate targeting opposition politicians almost singularly, the use of sedition against journalists, and let's not forget it, the horrible continuing, if not increasing, othering of Muslims. When you look at all of that, can you really seriously and credibly claim that Modi's India and Biden's America share values?
So you're asking a very difficult question because India is a democracy. It has a democratic culture. It has a democratic society. And there's a lot to India. There's a lot more to India than Modi or even the BJP. And I want people to remember that this is a vast country of 1.4 million people. When you go there and talk to people, you sense it. 1.4 billion people are not intolerant. They are not. If anything, Hinduism is a very tolerant religion. But the government has done the things you describe. I think it's unarguable that we have descended down a path. India has descended down a path that I once described as illiberal democracy. And is the level of illiberalism so great to mean that India is no longer really a functioning democracy? I don't think so. I mean, I think that look at the elections in Karnataka, you still have some strong democratic institutionalized mechanisms. One hopes that the courts will become more active again in blocking some of these illiberal tendencies. But what you describe is all true, and that's why the Post called it democratic backsliding. That's why I've called it illiberal democracy. Um, is it, is it of a sufficient, does it rise to a level where you'd say that India is not a democracy anymore? I don't think so. I think that India is still, I try to think about India in comparison to some of the democratic backsliding that has taken place around the world, because this is a global phenomenon. And I think India has not gone as far as Turkey in its backsliding. It's more in the realm of somebody like Viktor Orban in Hungary, which is very depressing. But Hungary is still a member of the European Union, and it's still regarded, again, broadly speaking, as democratic. That's one of the reasons I came up with that term, illiberal democracy, to try to recognize the complexity here of countries that are still holding free and fair elections, but undermining lots of the inner stuffing of democracy, the rule of law, the separations between, of independent agencies and judiciary, the treatment of minorities, which is in a bad state in India.
Let me put to you a very different view expressed very recently by Daniel Markey in Foreign Affairs. He says that the India-US relationship is not built on shared values, but shared convenience. And as he explains in that essay, which I'm sure you read, he says India wants access to American investment, technology, and now increasingly, as you pointed out, defense equipment. America, in return, wants access to India's 1.4 billion market, but it also wants to encourage India to be a bulwark against China, which to a limited extent Prime Minister Modi is prepared to be. And therefore, Markey concludes, and I'm quoting him, rather than considering India an ally in the fight for global democracy, the Biden administration must see that India is an ally of convenience. Would you agree with that view? Or if you don't, how strongly would you disagree?
I disagree with the view in a broad way, though I agree with some of the narrow specifics. Let me explain what I mean. It's clear that strategic alignment was necessary to create a strategic relationship. Look, India has been a democracy for a while. America has been a democracy for a while. Yet, if you looked in the 1970s and 80s, they were not allied. If anything, they were moderate adversaries. America was supporting Pakistan. India was supporting the Soviet Union. So it's not just the values that matter. Clearly, you also need to look at the world with the same strategic eyes. And what happened after the end of the Cold War was that India and the US both started to see the world with the same strategic eyes. But there was also, I think, the reality that these two countries are very comfortable with one another. And that's what I want to dwell. So I don't dispute the fact that there are core strategic alignments, economic and geopolitical, that matter. Of course there are. We don't live in an Alice in Wonderland world of that. You need that. But it is also true that these are two countries that are very close to one another in terms of their nature, their makeup, and their values. And here I'm talking not government to government, but society to society. Both America and India are open, messy, chaotic, diverse democracies. Indians, as you know, are fascinated by America. If you look at polls, India is one of the most pro-American countries in the world. I think that Israel and Poland and India regularly come out the top three in terms of favorable attitudes towards America. Every Indian businessman wants to do business in America. Every student wants to find a way to get a visa to America. American universities are the gold standard for India. There is a society to society bond here, and it's growing. And if things continue to go the way they are, it'll grow even deeper. That is very powerful. And when you have that kind of bond, it has to have an effect on the broader relationship, particularly given that these are two democracies. So there is going to be a bubbling up of these sentiments on both sides. So I tend to think that we sometimes underestimate this broader connection, this almost societal connection that is growing between these two countries, which I have to confess, I frankly hope becomes bigger and bigger, because not only will it make the bond stronger, but maybe it will even alleviate some of the things you were describing. The more India gets intertwined with America, the more I think it becomes difficult to have these really anti-democratic, illiberal tendencies, because India's destiny lies in being a great democracy, a great liberal democracy, and being allied with the great liberal democracies of the world, I believe. And in that situation, being an outlier, being a country that's doing the undermining the rule of law, undermining judicial independence, persecuting a minority, that doesn't fulfill that destiny.
One of the very catchy things you said in that comprehensive answer is that both countries need each other. And that reminds me of The Economist this week. It had at least 10 or 12 pages devoted to India. The Indian or Asian edition actually had the cover story based on the relationship. And the headline was America's New Best Friend. But the sub-headline was pretty ominous. It said, India does not love the West. Even so, America needs it. And that raises the question, what happens when America stops needing India? Or when it doesn't need India as much as it does today? What then?
Look, I thought the subhead was a little off, in the sense that India needs America just as much as America needs India. Look, China is 8,000 miles away from America. It's right at India's border. The geopolitical threat posed by a rising China and a more aggressive Chinese government and a more predatory Chinese economic policy of mercantilism, all of which Xi's China represents, is a very real pressing threat to India. For the United States, it's more about world order and what kind of international system is created and things like that. But India has its soldiers facing Chinese soldiers at a disputed border. This is, to my mind, a much more pressing issue. And I sometimes think that Indian foreign policy elites don't see it as such and have this fantasy that it's, they're doing America a favor by aligning with it. But it's not true. India needs America. Think about the defense discussion we were having. Now, if you're asking, Karan, if the whole world order changes somehow and there's a whole different set of constellation of threats and opportunities in the world, will these two countries still be strategically aligned? Who knows? I mean, as I said, possibly not. They weren't during the Cold War. Geopolitics matters, and geopolitics tends to trump everything else. But in the foreseeable future, it's difficult to see a world in which that geopolitical reality does not exist. That is a rising China and an India right next to it.
I take your point that a rising China and a China that appears to be threatening India is a situation that will ensure that the bonds that are at the moment holding America and India together will continue to remain strong. But there was a bit of doubt cast on that view by Ashley Tellis, again writing in Foreign Affairs, and again a few months ago, not that long ago. He said that for 2 decades, Washington has courted India in the hope that India will be a bulwark against China. But he added, it's now increasingly becoming clear that India wants US help in terms of India's problems vis-a-vis China, but it's not willing to help America in terms of America's problems vis-a-vis China. And I think he cited Taiwan in particular. And therefore, he raised the question, how far would Washington continue to go to court India? Now, clearly, with the visit starting tomorrow, that is not a danger that's looming on the horizon at all. At the moment, Washington is courting India with grand flattery, if anything. But is this a cloud that hovers over the horizon as you look down the road?
Ashley's article was very intelligent, and I think it raised an important issue, which is that India is going to be opportunistic, and it is not going to completely divorce itself from China, nor should it. India cannot achieve the economic growth it needs without having a healthy economic relationship with China. By the way, the same is true for the United States. The United States has, India, I think, does about 100 billion, or I can't remember the exact number, but America does $700 billion of trade with China, many times more than India does. China is America's third largest trading partner after Canada and Mexico, larger than any European country. So we all need to recognize that the complexity of this world is we are going to try to have good economic relations with all parties, including China, while maintaining some degree of strategic competition. What Ashley was pointing to particularly was Taiwan. But I don't think Washington expects India to come to the defense of Taiwan. It wouldn't deter China much. I mean, with all due respect, India doesn't have that kind of a navy. What Washington is looking to India for is to act as a bulwark against a China that tries to sort of dominate Asia economically, politically, and geopolitically, and to build a certain kind of Asian deterrence. And that's what the Quad is about, the alliance between, the grouping between Australia, Japan, India, and the US. And that is actually a case of strategic alignment. So I think that Ashley was raising a worthwhile caveat, but it's a caveat. It doesn't change the reality that there is some broad alignment.
Then let me end by picking up what you said, and in a sense putting the opposite of what I've been asking up till now. The significant improvement that we've seen in India-US relations has happened at almost precisely the same time as a similarly significant improvement in India-Japan relations and India-Australia relations. Both those relationships are probably today better than they've been at any time in the last 10, 12 years. And this is, by the way, the relationship that lies at the heart of Quad. And America has equally good relations with these countries as well. So are these bonds that will ensure that if needs change, if the China threat alters, nonetheless, the India-America bond and relationship will continue to flourish and remain strong? Or am I being romantic?
No, you're not being romantic. So to begin with, India has not had a particularly strategic view of the world for a long time, in my opinion. If you go back to Nehru, it was a kind of fundamentally romantic view of the world. We were going to be non-aligned. We didn't want to soil ourselves with the corruption of being allied to either side. We were going to be the good guys in the world. We were even going to be incredibly generous and warm toward China, even if they didn't reciprocate. And it's never been a kind of hard-headed pragmatism. In my view, during Indira Gandhi's period, there was an effort to do that, but frankly, she picked the wrong side in the Cold War, and that didn't go particularly well. I think what is now happening is that India is finding itself strategically, and it's finding a place for itself in an Asia in which China has become the dominant entity, or perhaps returned to being the dominant entity, because China was, if you go back 300 or 400 years, the dominant entity. And in that context, it is also finding that its friends and its closest friends are also countries it shares values with: Australia, Japan, but not even just those, Singapore, South Korea. There's a kind of open free world element to this grouping. And I think that India needs to be more strategic. It needs to be thinking harder about its relations with the rest of the world. We still have a very small foreign office. The MEA, even in per capita terms, is, I think, 1/4 the size of the Chinese Foreign Service. We need to have India needs to put its stamp on the world a bit more, to have more ambitions about that. But in that context, I think it's very gratifying, and it is actually a kind of force multiplying for its core relationships to be with some of the world's great democracies. And I think people who discount the importance of values and ideals in foreign policy miss the point. It's not, and I don't think you were saying this, it's not that interests don't matter. It's not that realpolitik is not important. Of course it is. It's the basis of it. But when you add to that an alignment of values, when you add to that shared ideals, shared political systems, a shared commitment to freedom and individual rights, it becomes a stronger bond. Think of it this way. The United States and Saudi Arabia have a state-to-state alliance. It's quite powerful. It's been 70 years in the making. It has delivered. But it's very different from the relationship the United States has with Britain, which is a society-to-society relationship, which is a people-to-people relationship. My belief is that India is going to end up having those kind of people-to-people, society-to-society, culture-to-culture relationship with the great democracies of the world, because its interests lie in that direction, its values lie in that direction, its people's aspirations lie in that direction. And wouldn't it be a great thing for India to be able to fulfill that destiny in a way that is in keeping with both its interests and its ideals?
Fareed Zakaria, thank you very much indeed for speaking to me.
Always a pleasure, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.